On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1189 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Tuesday evening into Wednesday. And thank you for joining us on the show. As always, my regular plea at this point is to subscribe to the podcast on any podcast platform, especially on YouTube. I announced on Tuesday that I'm doing something of a challenge at this point in time, trying to get to 1,000 subscriptions on YouTube by the end of the regular season. So if you are not a huge YouTube subscriber/user, I understand completely. I promise I do, but it takes just 2 seconds. Check out our Locked On Hawks YouTube page and subscribe today to support the show. Thank you in advance for that. As for the business at hand on today's podcast, the Hawks go into Boston and lose 107-98 on this Tuesday, and it was a game in which, if I only told you the final score of the game, it would have been very, very reasonable. The Hawks were underdogs in this game. It would not surprise me at all if they had lost this one in a competitive but not all that close game to the Celtics. With that said, the first half was all Hawks. They led by 17 points at one point in the first half and by 14 at halftime. And when I give you that information, this becomes a pretty ugly and frustrating loss for Atlanta. I have to say this at the very top of the podcast. This loss was extremely similar to the one that happened on Super Bowl Sunday just a couple of weeks ago in Boston. Same exact thing. National TV game. That was an ABC game. This was a TNT game on Tuesday. Up by double digits in the first half. By 15 points, actually, in that game, losing by 10. This game was up 17 in the first half, lose by 9. It was almost exactly the same formula, although there were some nuances in the middle of it. A frustrating game for Atlanta. So we'll get into all of this game now and what transpired and the back and forth and the player observations. But that's my top-line thought here is that this is a game the Hawks needed to win, given that they were up by 14 at the halftime break, and this is one they can absolutely steal, given all the nuance involved. And they just couldn't close the door. And a pretty shaky second half, all things considered. So we'll dive into the game now. The Hawks were actually 2-1 against Boston this season, and with this loss, they're now 2-2, a season-long split against Boston. Not the worst result in the world, but still one the Hawks could have gotten. Obviously, home court to the Celtics. We did a full preview of the game on Monday evening into Tuesday that kind of outlined how good they had been. Boston has been at home this season. But injury-wise, there was a lot to discuss both before and during this game. John Collins was listed as doubtful coming in. He was ruled out in pregame by Nick McMillan. No big surprise there. He's missed the last 6 games in a row for Atlanta. Nate basically said that he's day-to-day at this stage. Okay, nothing new, but there was some optimism on the broadcast from Stephanie Reddy about Collins working a little bit more at this stage. The Hawks have a back-to-back from here, by the way, on Thursday and Friday, so we'll see if he's able to go on either end of that side of that back-to-back. But obviously, huge loss, particularly against Boston. Collins' versatility, burst, finishing ability, defensive versatility, all that stuff would have been very useful in this game. Lou Williams also missed this one. His second straight game, he's actually been sidelined for 6 of the last 10, so Lou has not been exactly an every-night player at this stage. And then Sharif Cooper was still in the G League for this one for Atlanta. Boston actually had no injuries pregame, but Jaylen Brown, the second-best player, went out with about, 9 minutes to go in the first quarter. So I think he played 3 minutes, not even 3 minutes of this game, and was not able to return with an ankle issue. So that was a slight swing to Atlanta. And while the Hawks were actually, according to our friends at BetOnline, 6.5-point underdogs in this game, if I told you that Jaylen Brown would leave that early in the game, that number would not have been 6.5. The Hawks would have been underdogs almost certainly still, but it would have been like 3 or 2, something like that. So a big loss for them, and then we'll come back to this later on. But Trae Young gets injured in the game, but the Hawks stays in. And Nick Okongwu left at halftime with a concussion evaluation. So lots of factors in play for this one. And weirdly, as much as I just said the Hawks had this great first half, they had a disastrous start to this game. They missed 4 of the first 7 shots, I should say this. 4 of the first 7 shots were blocked. That's tough to do. Also, they went empty, a.k.a. with no points, on their first 8 possessions of the game on offense. And somehow, they were only down by 4 points. It was 4-0 after 4 minutes. It was pretty ugly on both sides of the floor. Trae finally scored on the 10th shot of the night. The Hawks were 0 of 9 from the floor to open the game. Hunter was struggling. Capella missed 2 shots at the rim. Lots of stuff that was bad on offense in this one. Trae then finally found it. Somebody had to, eventually, for the Hawks offensively. He did. Got to the rim a few times in pretty short order. But the Hawks were actually leading this game at one point while shooting 5 of 16 from the floor because Boston was turning the ball over and missing their own shots. Rotationally, the Hawks played 8-man rotation in both halves of this game. And that's about as shallow as you'll ever see a team play outside of like Nick Nurse and weird stuff like that. But for McMillan, 8 guys is very, very shallow. But again, without Collins and Lou, he doesn't trust anybody else. We saw them play Kevin Knox for like 2.5 minutes on Saturday. Tonight it was Gorgie Jang, but it was only in the second half because Okongwu couldn't play. So it was 8 guys in the first half, a different 8 guys in the second half, but still a very, very shallow rotation in this one. The Hawks had their first run of the night. It was 8-0 to go up by 5 in the first quarter. But then Trey gets fouled by Marcus Smart shooting a 3 and hurts his left ankle at the time. Smart gets called for a flagrant 1 foul. He definitely earned that flagrant 1 with the Zaza Pachulia rule of not letting a guy land. He slid under him. I know Hawks fans were very, very upset with this. It looked like Trey and Smart were okay both during and after. They had a sort of an embrace after the game. So it looked like Trey was not taking it too personally, but Smart with a dangerous play for sure. He was rewarded with a flagrant foul in this one. But when Trey did stay in the game to shoot his free throws, which is important because that way he can come back if he was able to be cleared. But he was hobbling pretty badly. And after the game, Trey talks about the fact that he was definitely in some pain. He got stiff in the second half, etc. I will note, and we'll come back to this later on, he was definitely a step or two slower. And that's not a huge surprise. Obviously, with a pretty significant ankle issue like he had in this spot, him coming back at all is a reminder of just how tough he is. He kind of just tightened it up and he was ready to go again. And he was still pretty effective, but at the same time, that's something to keep an eye on for the future because that was a significant enough injury where he was hobbling afterwards and went straight to the locker room, etc. But then DeLon Wright got fouled on a 3 at the buzzer of the first quarter. He made all 3, and the Hawks scored the final 9 points of the first quarter. And it was totally bizarre, and the Hawks shot 36% from the floor in the first quarter and led by 9 points because they were 9 of 10 from the floor. 9 of 10 at the free throw line. And 1 turnover. Boston was 19 points on 26 possessions, which is dreadful offense. So even with a pretty ugly first quarter offensively, in a lot of ways for the Hawks, they were in control and led by 13 early in the second quarter. Okongwu got some foul trouble. He had 3 fouls in his first 7 minutes of action in this one. He ended up coming back in, except for he didn't come back in. That's one of the things I had that written down wrong in my notes. But as a point of clarity, he got his 3rd foul. And we didn't know this at the time. In fact, we didn't know until halftime. But Okongwu was then treated at halftime for concussion symptoms and was ruled out for the rest of the game. So from that point forward, early in the second quarter, the Hawks played Capella the rest of the half, and then played Gorgie Jang for a few minutes in the second half. But it was really just an 8-man rotation from that stage forward. The Hawks had their biggest run of the night, a 15-5 push in the second to go up 49-33. It started out with Kevin Huerter scoring 7 points in about 90 seconds. That was a huge little run for him. And then Gallinari and Bogdanovich got it going with some shot making. Gallinari had Aaron Nesmith in peril. Let's just say he had no idea what to do against Gallo on defense. And after that horrendous start by the Hawks, they scored 49 points in less than 14 minutes of action against the number 2 defense in the league in Boston. They were 18 of 27 shooting in that time span. Of course, that was the only time in this game the Hawks were good on offense, but they were really good for 14 minutes in this spot. Trey came back in about halfway through the second quarter and was obviously not great in terms of movement, but was obviously, he's very, very crafty and, of course, very skilled. He has a ton of gravity. He's also just super tough. Good to see him coming back in. He was still able to do a lot as a jump shooter, as a passer, etc. And Boston was really playing pretty poorly on defense, I think, in the first half. Like some switches they were blowing against Trey. Their drop coverage was definitely quite shaky against Trey as well. And after all of that, the Hawks were up by 14 at the halftime break, up by 17, as many as 17 in the first half. And the offense for the whole half, even with a slow start, they had a 122 offensive rating before halftime. And Boston's defense being in play there, that's pretty crazy. They have only 8 assists, which is a little bit strange for that good of a half offensively. They were pretty self-created in terms of their shot making in the first half. And basically anyone but Hunter was pretty hot at some stage of that first half. But Trey had 22 at halftime, despite leading with the injury. And Boston's offense was pedestrian. They only scored exactly 1 point per possession in the first half. And the Hawks were turning the ball over defensively, which is good. That's what you want to do. So lots of positives. Got to the line a bunch in the first half. And going into halftime, again, knowing that Jaylen Brown is out as well, the Hawks were significantly favored to win this game at halftime. Even if you were to factor in some variance, home court for Boston, etc., without Jaylen Brown, Trey comes back in. It's all coming up Atlanta at the halftime break. And, of course, we'll get into what happened after the break in a moment. But first, a word from our sponsors on the show today. NBA fans looking for a daily fantasy option at this point in time? If you are, you need to check out the award-winning app at PrizePicks. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. I love it and know that you will too. It's so easy to use above all else. All you do is pick 2 to 5 players and an over-under on their projections. So you can win up to 10 times on any entry. It's just you against the projected numbers. An entire entry can be done in just a minute or less. It's just that easy. PrizePicks is also safe and offers fast withdrawals. And they offer props on almost anything you can think of, including points and rebounds and assists, and even steals on the basketball side. And if you don't love only basketball, they have mixed sports entries as well. If you're into MMA or soccer, even college hoops, you can pair different things together to use all those skills collectively. And for a limited time, PrizePicks has an exclusive offer for all of our listeners, and it's an absolute no-brainer. You can get $50 for free if a player in your first PrizePicks entry scores even a single point if you use the promo code NBA. That's right, it's an exclusive offer for Locked On fans only. Sign up today, use the promo code NBA, and get $50 for free if a player in your first entry scores a single point. Check it all out at PrizePicks. All right, and we'll dive into the second half now. As I mentioned before, during halftime, they announced that Okongwu was being evaluated for concussion. He'd be out. And again, McMillan said after the game that Okongwu had some symptoms, so they had to hold him out of the game. That's all we know in terms of updates right now. But they went to Gorgui Dieng. That was the logical thing to do late in the third quarter for a few minutes. He was reasonable enough. Defensively, though, not the same. Obviously, going from Capella and Okongwu to Dieng is a large drop-off. Dieng can obviously shoot a little bit, but that was a huge drop. But the biggest swing in the entire game in my mind actually was the first few minutes of the third quarter. And that was a 14-0 run by Boston to open the half and tie the game. So the Hawks went from up 14 to tied in the span of 9 possessions on offense. They did not score on 9 possessions in a row on offense. So to recap, to open the game, the Hawks could not score coming out of the game. They were 0 of 8 in terms of getting points on possessions in the first quarter. And then they came out of the halftime break and then didn't score on 9 in a row. That repeated the first half. And this time around, Boston was actually making shots to tie the game. Then Herter got his 4th foul. He had to come out, and Hunter was struggling pretty badly, so that was definitely a problem. We'll come back to that later on as well. Trey finally made a shot to break the silence, and then Tatum answered from there, and Boston took their first lead in a long time. There's actually a gift in which Grant Williams missed a layup in transition that led to a nice Capella dunk off a pass from Bogdanovich, but that did not exactly kickstart things for the Hawks. Boston was just better on both ends of the floor for really the entire second half. And the third quarter was 31-13 in favor of Boston. The fourth quarter wasn't quite that bad. Well, the Hawks were 6 of 20 from the floor in the third, 1 of 8 from 3, and no free throw attempts. So they got to the line a ton in the first half, nothing in the third quarter. The shots didn't fall. They took care of the ball. And other than Bogdanovich, there was just nothing going on offense. Trey, whether it was the halftime, having to get through that and be a little bit colder, he was not the same guy in the second half. And Boston was making shots in the way they did before halftime. In the fourth quarter, there were little positive stretches. Bogdanovich had a nice bucket early in the fourth quarter. A couple of shots by, Gorgui made a jumper. They couldn't play Gorgui with Gallinari, so that limits their options. That's pretty obvious to me anyway, but defensively, you just cannot play Dieng and Gallo together against Boston or really most teams, I'll say. So they had to wait to bring Gallo back until Capella came back in. Actually, the Hawks were benefiting from a lost challenge by Boston. With about 7 minutes to go, they were down by 8, the Hawks were, and Boston challenged a foul call on Peyton Pritchard that would have put Bogey at the line. They lost that challenge. Bogey makes both free throws, and it's a 6-point game again. But then Herter gets his 5th foul. They actually stayed with him in that spot, which kind of spoke to how much Hunter was struggling on offense at that point in time. But Boston got up to 10 with about 5.5 minutes to go, and they called timeout. At that point, it was 45-21 to start the third quarter and into the fourth quarter. That just kind of tells the story. That little extended run was basically the game, from the Hawks being up 14 to being down 7, down 10. And, pretty rough stuff. Now, after that, the number one sequence that kind of lost the game for the Hawks in terms of making it official, and again, they were already probably going to lose. They were already down by 8 at this point. But they got to stop after a timeout and a couple chances to cut it to 6 transition. But Hunter gets blocked by Smart in transition, and that was a play that was, let's just say, a microcosm of the night for Hunter, who was brutal on offense in this game. But Smart made a heck of a play, so kudos to him. That would have made it 6 if he could have finished that transition. Other than the floor, Boston makes a 3, and suddenly they're down 11. Then Hunter turns it over again on the next possession. Another 3 by Boston, and it's a 14-point game with 3 minutes to go. So the Hawks had a chance to get to 6, and then within 3 possessions, it was a 14-point game. And it wasn't 100% over at that point. The Hawks got down to 8 with like 140 left. But really, if you look at the game flow of this one, the game really ended in my mind on that sequence when it was block 3, turnover 3, 14-point game. And we'll leave it there for now. So as far as the second half was concerned, 56-33 after halftime. The Hawks were 260 from 3 in the second half, 33% from the floor, 7 assists, 5 turnovers. Boston shot it pretty well and had 12 assists in the second half. It wasn't like they were awesome on offense. The Hawks just could not score. And because of that, the Hawks' offensive rating in this game was about a 102 in the competitive portion. That is not very good, let's just say, for anyone, much less the Hawks being a top 5 offense in the league this year, number 2 coming into the night in offensive rating. 52% true shooting is not good even against Boston. They got to the line for 24 free throw attempts. That's pretty good. But they could not make a 3 in this game. They were 7 of 24. That's 7 of 31 from 3. That's even worse. And from there, they actually shot well from 2, 56%, just not incredibly good, and 15 assists in this one for Atlanta. That's a weirdly low number for the Hawks, and kind of a lot of self-creation reliance, let's just say, on offense. And then defensively, it wasn't putrid for the Hawks in this game, about a 115 defensive rating, but they didn't do a ton of great things defensively. When Capella was out there, they were able to get some stops, but when he wasn't, it was a little bit shakier. And that dang stint in the second half, not his fault, but he was getting blown by in a way that Capella and Conwood just don't in a lot of ways. So also Boston had 27 assists, almost double that of the Hawks in this game. And they shot 58% on 2s. So, I can give you all of the ugliness in the world, let's just say, in the second half. But broadly speaking, in this one, it was a tale of 2 halves. I think the Hawks were fortunate to be up by 14 points at halftime with how they played in the first half. And Boston definitely came alive after halftime and shot it much better, etc. But the Hawks just did not have anything going on offense, whether it was Hunter being kind of a catastrophe in this one. Honestly, Herter cooled off. And aside from Trey in the first half and Bogey in the whole game, there was not a whole lot of offensive juice happening in this one for Atlanta. So we're getting into all of why that was on the player evaluation side. But in terms of just the team stuff, there's no shame in being slowed by Boston's defense because they are very, very good. But the Hawks, I would say, still perform below that expectation on offense, even when you account for Boston's defense. And then defensively, they were okay, but they were not good enough to overcome the slow offense. And for this team, if they're going to have a bad offensive night, it's going to be tough in a lot of ways, particularly on the road against a good team, and they had a bad offensive night in this one. All right, before we get into the rest of this podcast in terms of some player observations and look at the standings, etc., a word from our sponsors on the show. We're into March now, and usually by this time of year, I've given up on all my resolutions for the new year, but this time around, I've sticking to at least one of them, and that's to eat right with a hat tip to Built Bar. It feels like it's not even really a resolution for me at this point because I actually enjoy eating Built Bars, from protein-infused puff bars that are fantastic to all the other fan favorites from Built Bar. Each and every Built Bar has 100% real chocolate, which makes a huge difference, honestly. It tastes fantastic because of that. On top of the taste, Built Bar has low calorie and they are high protein. You can easily replace your candy bars with Built Bars, both in taste and to improve your nutrition. If you go to Built.com right now, check out the nutrition and be blown away by it. Most Built Bars have only 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein with a very low calorie count. And from there, the flavors are bountiful. Some flavors are more like favorites with coconut almond and mint brownie, but they also have some new flavors with white chocolate cookies and cream and many more. Each flavor is delicious. They have new flavors coming out all the time, and it's always great to check out Built.com for all the latest. And the best way to find out from Built Bar, both in ordering and getting all the information that you need, is to go to Built.com and use the promo code LOCKED15. If you do that, you have 15% off on your first order and your next order, and then order after that with Built Bar. That's promo code LOCKED15, 15% off at Built.com. All right, we'll dive into the player evaluations now on this podcast. And yeah, it wasn't, all roses for the Hawks in this one. There were some positives for sure, but we'll start with the bench. And the bench was weird, as I said before. Only 8-man rotation in this game and only 3 bench guys in each half. The 2 guys who played in both halves were DeLon Wright and Bogdanovich. DeLon played solidly, 5 points, 2 steals, a block, an assist, 3 rebounds. for DeLon. 104 from the floor, but got to the line 3 times, made all 3. So not terrible efficiency, even with his only 5 points. He was +4 in his minutes. I think it was a good DeLon Wright game, not an elite one, not a terrible one, just kind of right in the middle. Did all the little stuff that he always does, and he was a positive factor on the whole. Bogey was awesome. He was the brightest spot for the Hawks. Trey's first half was certainly the best half by anyone on the Hawks roster in this game, but Bogey for the full game was very good. 25 points, 3 assists, 4 rebounds. He was 7 of 7 on twos. Only 3 rebounds on threes, but that's totally fine for his output in terms of volume. And with this one, by the way, he's now scored 23 points or more, and I believe it is, 5 of the last 7 games. So he has really found his stride. We talked about him a lot in the last week or two, but he has been a different player in the last 6 weeks, 5 weeks since he came back from the injury, and he has been a huge factor in the Hawks playing better basketball. That was the case in this one. He was actually +6 in his minutes in 37 minutes, so the Hawks were -15 with Boogie off the floor in 11 minutes. There you go. The 2 guys who played backup center in this game, Okongwu actually played pretty well. It was at 5 points. No rebounds, though, which is a little bit strange in 7 minutes, but only 7 minutes, +10, etc. Gorgie, like I said before, defensively it was a problem, but offensively he gave him a little bit of juice with his jump shot. We'll leave that there for now. Nothing huge to say about that. But if Okongwu were to miss some time, being without Okongwu and Collins just limits them so greatly in terms of lineup versatility. People were asking me during this game why Gorgie was playing. And my response is he's the only option they have. The small ball 5 that the Hawks have played this year is John Collins, and he was unavailable, and the Kong was out. And yes, I guess they could have gone to Jalen Johnson in theory as a backup 5, but Nate's just never going to do that in the second half of the game with just ice cold. And Boston is fairly big. They're huge on the wings with Tatum, especially when Brown's playing. But even when they were playing, Grant Williams at the 4, or Al Horford's obviously a big 4. Robert Williams is a full-size center. This is a big team they're playing against in a lot of ways. So couldn't really afford to go super duper small. And Gorgie gave them what he could give them. But we'll see if Okongwu can play on Thursday. But if both he and Collins are out, that is a tough alignment for Atlanta. To the starters in this one. And we'll start with the most negative of any player by a wide margin in this game. That was DeAndre Hunter. DeAndre Hunter was very bad tonight. And I am not someone who is going to come out and be, hyperbolic and pile on. But let's just say he was not good. That is definitely the case. It's one of those things. I got a text that I shared on Twitter that I'll share also here from someone I would say is in the NBA circle. I'm not going to give anything else away with them. They're not affiliated with the Hawks, but I got a text during the game. It's a TNT game, obviously more eyes on the game, but the quote was, "What the hell happened to DeAndre Hunter?" And if you're just watching this game or the last couple of weeks only on Hunter, you would certainly have that takeaway. He's been so bad on offense recently. He was okay from the floor in this one. 0 of 5 on twos, had at least one, I would say, no, at least 3 shots blocked, I think, in this game. Only 1 turnover, but maybe a couple of generous non-turnovers for him. -11. Defensively, he's at least the only guy they have that has the physical capability of stopping Tatum, but even then, he was not fantastic defensively in this game either. But this does not mean that I'm writing him off entirely. People are asking me if he's a bust now. That's overreacting. But I have to say, he's not been good this year on the whole. His offense had been carried by 3-point shooting for most of the season in terms of that's been his best attribute offensively this year. It still looks fine. But even coming into the night, he was at 47% on twos for the season. He was 0 of 5 in this one. That's bad. He now has, I believe, as many turnovers as assists, maybe even 1 more turnover than assists for the season. If you factor in tonight's number. So it's a bit of a mess right now. We'll have more on this in the future, but he was a huge negative, and it's just kind of tough to avoid that. Was he the reason when the Hawks lost this game? No, but was he good? Definitely not. And the -11 was earned, let's just say, in this one. Gallinari, pluses and minuses, 12 points, 8 rebounds, only 9 shot attempts. He was efficient enough offensively, 35 minutes. They were not great in his minutes necessarily, but it's a bad matchup for him in a lot of ways defensively, especially when Boston's going a little bit smaller. But he was okay. I thought he did his job, and they needed his shot creation in this one. He had a good stretch in the first half for sure. Capella, I thought, was pretty good on the whole. He had a couple of high-profile miss bunnies as often on offense. But on the glass, he was their best player as usual. 11 rebounds in 30 minutes, 5 points, had a steal. He was good defensively, I think, in this game. Offensively, not fantastic by any means, but that's a typical Capella line at this point. Herter, good first half, not as good in the second half. Obviously, he got pretty cold, as a lot of the Hawks did. 9 points on 13 shots is not what you want. Did have 2 steals and 2 blocks, so he was active there, actually fouled out of the game in 31 minutes. 5 rebounds, 3 assists. He had a pretty good floor game, just didn't have his shot necessarily in this one. It was only 3 of 8 on 2s, 1 of 5 on 3s, and that's below where you want him to be. And then Trae Young, 31 points on 12-25 from the floor, 2 of 7 from 3, 5-6 from the free throw line, 10 of 18 on 2s is very, very solid for him. Again, first half, he was lights out. Second half, not quite the same, but that's okay when you realize he had the ankle issue. He's going to keep playing through what he says. I'm sure they'll do a more thorough evaluation, that's for sure, at this stage, but we'll see how he looks on Thursday. He'll keep trying to play. I can almost assure you on that. Trae does not like to miss games. He will definitely be trying to play through things and be as good as he can be, but that's obviously the Hawks cannot afford to have him make anything less than full strength. He's been incredible this year, all NBA level player, but it showed even tonight that if he's not 100%, the Hawks are going to have that uphill battle in a lot of ways. Lots of stuff being thrown around after the game. I think Bogdanovich even mentioned something about DeAndre Hunter not being able to execute certain things, talking about being guarded by Grant Williams, etc. Bogey mentioned pretty candidly that being up by 15 points and then losing one of the top 2 guys on the other team, and obviously you still lose that game. That's just kind of what it is. I think that can be overstated in some respects, but Jaylen Brown going out of this game and the Hawks being up by 15 points, that's a bad loss. I mean, it's not. You can view what you want to view in this one, but I would say coming into the night, losing by single digits to the Celtics would have been a reasonable result. At halftime, losing this game by 9 points is not a reasonable result. So that's all I have on that for now. As for the standings, the Hawks lose this game. They now fall to 11-19 on the road. That's pretty ugly. They are still 18-13 at home, which is solid enough, but not great there. And with the loss, they're now back into a tie with the Hornets for the 9 seed in the East. That is not where you want to be, although the Hornets have been struggling for a while now. But Washington won tonight, and while I have kind of written them off in some respects, the Hawks have a 1-game lead on the Wizards. I don't believe in the Wizards really at all, but a 1-game lead is a 1-game lead, and there's nothing assured about the Hawks being in the play-in right now. Would I pick them? Yes. I talked about that at much more length on yesterday's podcast, which, by the way, is still available in your feeds if you missed it. But, a loss here, Washington wins. They play the Wizards on Friday. If you lose that game, it gets a little bit dicey. So that'll be a one that has some pressure, that's for sure. And speaking of which, the Hawks are home for the Bulls on Thursday. The Bulls are a team that is good, number one. That's worth noting. I think they're not quite as good as their record at this point in time, but they just beat the Hawks at home in Chicago earlier, I guess it was last week now. The rematch here, the Bulls have lost 2 in a row since then. That's a very winnable game for the Hawks if they are at full strength. We'll see on Collins. We'll see on Trae. We'll see on Okongwu between now and then. But that's 3 guys up in the air, at least to some degree, for Thursday, not even including Lou Williams, who's been the backup point guard this year. So a lot of uncertainty for that one. But at home, I would tell you that the Hawks are supposed to be, I would say, small favorites against the Bulls in my mind, maybe a coin flip, something like that. But if you're without Trae, if you're without Collins, etc., it gets more difficult. And then from there, they turn around and have to fly to D.C. and play a back-to-back. And like I just said, the Hawks are better than the Wizards. I'm firmly in that camp. But it's a quick turnaround with travel, and it's not like the shortest flight in the world. And also, Washington is now off for 2 days. So you'll have a 2-day rest disadvantage plus travel. That's a brutal one. So we'll see. That's kind of a schedule loss screaming at you if you don't come up with your best effort in that game. So we've covered a lot of bases on this podcast, but not a great night at the office for the Hawks. The injury stuff is important. I think the single biggest thing on the agenda between now and Thursday is just making sure Trae Young's ankle is okay, because if he's hampered at all, your season's in serious peril. But provided he's 100%, knock on wood, we'll see what lasts with Collins. But it's a game the Hawks could have won, and they probably should have won. And I went down the rabbit hole on the podcast yesterday about the loss that the Hawks have had, and in their last 19 games, the Hawks are 12-7, and 6 of those 7 losses are quote unquote good losses on paper. They're all to good teams, most of them on the road, etc. But because you dug the hole that you dug, if you're the Hawks, you cannot afford to lose all of these games, and they keep losing games they probably should or at least could have won, and that is devastating at this point in the season. So with all that said, we'll have full coverage of our next I guess the next telecast on this show will be after the game on Thursday, barring some huge emergency news on Wednesday. I could break in with the emergency podcast. But in terms of planned episodes, next show will be after the game on Thursday, followed by another show after the game on Friday. Wrap up the week in busy fashion. Please subscribe to this podcast on your player of choice, whether that be Apple Podcasts or Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, etc. And I'm begging you at this point in time to help me get to the goal that I have of 1,000 subscriptions on YouTube between now and the end of the regular season. You have about 5 weeks to help me get there, and I appreciate all the support on this feed. Follow me on Twitter at BT Rowland. Follow the show on Twitter at LockedOnHawks. And we'll see you after the game on Thursday.